Welcome to the Data Coffee Break podcast. I'm Marc.
And I'm Christian.
If you are passionate about data like us, take a seat, relax, and join us to our coffee break where we discuss all things data.
And remember, there are no filters, no PR.
It's just a real life experience. So let's begin. Hello, Christian. How are you doing today?
All good, Marc. How are you doing?
Good. I'm dialing from Cape Town in South Africa today, where I was spending the week to visit some partners with my colleagues. So great experience to visit the partners and great opportunity here. Hopefully I can do some wine tasting over the weekend as well.
Yeah, sounds lovely. I used to go there quite often. So yeah, good memories.
And today we do a guest session, right?
Yes, today we have a super guest in our show. We are joined by a seasoned professional, a speaker, an ex-colleague, and actually he was there in South Africa before our time. He used to be a technical sales specialist, solution engineer at companies like Dell, Tableau, and IBM, where he was always highly regarded. He's also the founding partner of Adversus Capital, which was his first venture into the alternative data, and he's now head of research at a company that specializes on producing global reports that predicts KPIs using alternative data for fintech, travel, food delivery, among others. He holds a degree on computer science from the University of Edinburgh. He's always enigmatic, to the point, an amazing and reliable friend and colleague. And today we have Alex Lokhov. Welcome.
Welcome, Alex.
Thank you, guys.
I remember when we were working together, you used to also go to South Africa.
Yeah, I think I went maybe 2 or 3 times. Always very memorable trips. Because especially if you can combine your business trip with staying there for like a weekend, then it's like truly amazing things that you can do there, and and nature and food and everything else. I'm jealous, Marc.
Yeah.
Any tips?
Yeah, well, Cape Town is in general is beautiful. Like, what's the mountain called? We climb to the top.
Table Mountain.
Just like go there and take some pictures.
Yeah.
Like it's a truly unique place.
I will do as much as possible in terms of visiting and enjoying over the weekend. Thanks a lot.
Yes. And today we're going to discuss quite an interesting topic, in my opinion, especially for our audience. It's not a topic that comes every day, but it's something that is up and coming. In my view, it's the alternative data. I know, Alex, since I met you, you have always been really into financial markets, capital markets, stock trading. Can you tell us what is the alternative data? Because that even sounds a bit mysterious.
I think most people never heard about it.
Sure. Do you guys even know much about it yourself, like before I start? Because I think maybe you, Christian, at least, maybe you heard that term before. And Marc, I don't know if you actually even know anything about it.
In my case, it's Christian who introduced me to that a couple of months ago. First, I thought like it was an interesting name, and the concept is quite it's quite interesting to consider as like non-traditional type of data. I would call that. Yeah, assume we don't know.
Okay, good. I'll try to make it as simple as possible. I think usually the best way to explain some of these concepts is just to use specific examples. So alternative data is a term that is, I would say, most commonly used in the financial services industry specifically.
Yep.
So imagine that you're an investor and you try to decide if, let's say, investing in any company is actually a good idea. Like, let's say I'm going to use a specific example of Meta because it's been on the news recently a lot. You essentially just trying to decide if that investment is going to be a good idea or not. And let's say your thesis is just based on whether you agree or disagree with the success of metaverse, right? So are we all going to buy these VR headsets and wear them every day and live in this metaverse? So maybe you have the opposite idea. You think that this is just hype and this is never going to work, right? So the most simple thing you can do is you can just have your own subjective opinion based on how you feel about it, right? And we all have our own opinions. And eventually, let's say if we make investments, then the market will decide who is right and who is wrong. So that's the most simple thing you can do. You can then try to be a bit more scientific about it, right? You can go into, let's say, Meta's investor relations website And you can read their earnings reports, and they will usually tell you something like, okay, this is how that company did last quarter. Maybe they will tell you a little bit about the guidance for the next quarter, company's plans. But essentially, it's something that is released on a quarterly basis. And the company will only share things that they kind of want to share. So that would be your next place to look at. And then maybe you want to listen to some industry analysts, what they're saying about the company. So that's, again, a kind of a traditional source of information.
Like Kramer in this case?
Oh, yeah, somebody like that. Yeah, sure, he's famous.
Yes.
I think he's quite, now has a reputation of being wrong most of the time. So people try to do the opposite of what he's actually recommending. So all these things, I would say these are kind of traditional data sources that people have been using for many years. And there is nothing wrong with them, but going back to my example, hey, I just want to know if this, let's say, a specific VR gadget is doing well in the market. I probably want to know that, well, ideally not in real time, but let's say, on a daily, on a weekly basis, I want to track sales of the gadget. I don't want to wait till the end of next quarter for Meta to release that information. I want to be a bit more agile, I guess, and making my investment decisions based on what's actually happening right now. And so this is where alternative data comes into play. So some examples of that would be, I might want to reach out to a credit card company, right? So many credit card companies these days offer these data sets, which essentially like anonymized transaction data sets. They're usually aggregated, right? So I cannot identify any specific individual, but it will tell me how much a specific company is selling. Like in this case, this would be Meta. Maybe I would look at web traffic data, right? Okay. So I don't actually own a VR gadget like from Meta, but I would imagine every time you buy one, you probably need to go and register it somewhere on the website. So if you could track the number of people going to the website, that will again tell you roughly how many people are actually activating these headsets, and again, almost in real time, tell you how successful that product is in the market. And then maybe the last example of that would be, if you really want to be like very nuanced, very specific, you can do something as crazy as like start looking at these headsets, and maybe there is a serial number on the headset, and maybe it's sequential. So if you buy one headset this quarter and then another headset, like let's say next quarter, that will roughly tell you how many headsets were sold or manufactured during that period, right?
Interesting.
So there are many creative ideas that people have, and many interesting ideas and innovative ideas. I would say in practice, it's very rare that people would just use one data source. They typically would combine them in a clever way. We call it a mosaic. And it's obviously mostly used by institutional investors. There is a mature industry that's been created around this whole concept where I don't have to go and actually find this data myself. There is almost always someone who is already collecting it, cleaning it for me. So you would essentially just subscribe to one of these products from one of these data vendors, and essentially just someone else will do the legwork for me in that case.
Basically, we can consider those data assets, alternative data, as a counter check of what the company is sharing with you and with us, and to try to look for wider trends. Does it mean it's also to look for a wider trend for a specific industry as well?
Yeah, many people do very different things. Like, so if you can go very deep into a specific company, that's one way of doing it. Or you can start looking at things at more macro level. So there are many people who currently a very topical thing that people try to do is they're trying to forecast inflation because it moves up and down a lot. And like every time, a central bank would release new inflation numbers, again, people often try to predict what that number is going to be because obviously it has big impact on the market. So yeah, you can sort of do it both ways. You can go very company specific. Typically we call it like fundamental research, when you go deep into a specific company and try to maybe forecast KPIs, or you want to do it at a more like generic level, either analyze a large universe of companies or even start trying to predict some macro KPIs as well.
My mind is just going through two main questions. One is this data is not small. The level of detail and granularity that you go there, I think it's a massive amount of data, perhaps? And the other thing is like, how do you discover new data?
The first question is actually very interesting because I was listening to one of your other guests on this podcast, and I think you guys were talking about small data.
Yeah.
And that was actually very relevant to what we do.
Okay.
Because I would agree that, because on one hand, yes, quite often you have very rich and very granular data set that you're trying to analyze. But then in the end of the day, you have the ground truth, which is typically what the company would actually report. And that is done at the quarterly level. So in some extreme situations, you could have like 8 data points that you try to aggregate all your data to. And that's all you have to work with. Like that is kind of what is telling you if your model is actually good or not. So I would say, I'm also on the small data team, I think. Small data we should definitely turn it into like the new buzzword for the industry, because we do face those same challenges where like such a small data set means that you have to be very careful not to like overcomplicate your models, not to over-engineer the solution, because usually the simplest solution works best. And if it doesn't work, then you have to look for a different data set. Forget about like neural networks and things like that. That's all.
So linear regression is the right solution most of the time.
Yeah.
You would be surprised. Sometimes even that is an overkill.
Okay.
Yeah. We try to make it as simple as possible.
And I'm guessing so it's good to, in those cases when you have like so few in terms of information, not that much data, it's good to counterbalance with a portfolio of different data assets that you could kind of cross-reference, cross-check to get a better picture. There's not only one stream of data down the line.
Yeah, possibly. Yeah, I think your second question was, how do you find new data? Yeah, like again, it's an interesting question, because I would say that some of these data sets are very commonly used these days. They're almost like table stakes. Everyone knows about them. They're like credit card data, for instance, is a very established, I would say, category of alternative data. It's in particular in the US, I think there is very good coverage, and some data providers offering really big panels. In many cases, some of these data sets are just generally known already. There are companies who actually specialize in data discovery. So, I mean, obviously you can try to do it yourself, but the industry is maturing. So I already talked about data vendors and data buyers. And then there are many people who kind of sit in between. So they help with scouting for new data sets. And they offer like consulting services about how to best leverage data. And some of them actually deliver very valuable service, because if you're an investor, you typically don't actually even think about data. You just have a question that you want to answer. Like your question might be, okay, how many VR gadgets Facebook are selling this week, right? And you don't have expertise and you don't know which data set would help you answer the question best. So all the examples that I used before, like there would be companies who actually kind of specialize in telling you what the best data source might be for answering that specific question about that specific company. So the industry is maturing rapidly, and there are many people who kind of help with finding new data sets these days.
Just being a bit of devil's advocate, have you found the situation or heard about like some data not being necessarily legal, or can, going through those, through the faults, can fall through the cracks with regulations and compliance?
I like that Christian is always bringing a devil's advocate point to any podcast.
Yeah, it's very topical. Like it's not even, it happens a lot. Well, I wouldn't say a lot. It happened a few times. There are some publicly known legal cases. I can think of just a legal case that I think it's still being looked at in the US, where there is a company that has been scraping LinkedIn website, and they were basically just scraping people's profiles. And it was essentially the legal case was looked at it's been going on for quite some time now, because there is no precedent, like no one's done it before. The company is basically saying that, hey, if LinkedIn has this data publicly available, then there should be no reason why they should prevent people scraping it, because like if a human being can see it, especially without registering on the website, then why should it be illegal to collect the data in an automated fashion? But then LinkedIn might have their own terms and conditions, right? And if those terms and conditions were violated, then obviously it's not cool. So I find that in many of these cases, the technology is almost ahead of the existing legal framework, and we almost have to kind of decide on what is right and wrong from the legal point of view. But you might already have a business that's kind of already exists, and they already have customers and the revenue and data products that other people rely on. So again, the industry is going through this phase of maturity, and many of these laws change as well. So yeah, just like some examples I heard of.
Quick one. If you're enjoying this episode and our show, please make sure you follow us on LinkedIn, Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok. Links on the description as per usual.
Also, if you'd like to grow this community with us, think about sharing this episode with a friend or a colleague interested about all things data.
Now, back to the episode. The other day I was listening to, I think it was the podcast on alternative data. And the types of data sets that you're referring to are quite interesting, but they were also talking about satellite data, phone tracking information. I mean, I'm not trying to say there is a buzzword inside alternative data, or is that something that you see as a use case, or is more niche?
I would say, yeah, it's interesting. Like, I think many people have this perception of alternative data as, like we're in some James Bond movie, and we're tracking we're tracking private jets, and these executives flying to a specific location, and if they go to the same place, and it's very likely there's going to be some M&A activity or something like that. Again, there are people who do this kind of stuff.
Wow.
They would literally tell you what CEO had for breakfast, like this morning, like if you want to know that. But I would say that's probably a minority. Most of the work that we do is actually quite boring. Like find, little bits of gold dust in the ocean of sand, essentially. I know that's a good analogy, but that's kind of what we do. Things like satellite images, tracking private jets, or using location data. There are some people who do it. Also, the other thing that increasingly becomes more and more relevant is all kinds of privacy. Yeah, as you can imagine, if you're tracking someone's location, then immediately you start raising concerns about does this person actually know that he or she is being tracked? So I would say in the early days there were many situations where people kind of didn't really pay too much attention to this, and they just use the data no matter what. Nowadays the industry is more mature. All large clients who might want to use your data, they will typically have a compliance team. So they don't just want to buy or subscribe to a data set. They actually want to know where it's coming from. Do you have the consent of the end user to share this data? And this is being taken very, very seriously these days.
For the broader audience in terms of organizations, obviously here you're describing a specific industry with, I'm pretty sure a lot of people know each other, as like you encounter the same people in terms of buyers and sellers. But any organization, could you leverage those data assets?
Yeah, good question. So I would say, it's almost like we invented this term, or like other people invented this term, and they use it exclusively in the financial services industry. But actually, well, first of all, the terminology itself is something that people kind of think about, because like we still call it alternative data, but is it actually alternative? Because if everyone's using it, then maybe we should stop calling it alternative. So there have been there've been attempts to rebrand it. I heard the term external data, so maybe it kind of makes more sense. I also heard some people say, let's just call it data. Like, why do we even need a term for this, right?
But alternative data sounds edgy. That's nice.
Exactly. So my point is, I think outside of the financial services space, companies use external data assets, and they've been doing it for many years. They just don't call it alternative data. So again, going back to kind of some of the roles I had before, and I worked with different clients, people use these external data to track, let's say, what their competitors are doing, right? Again, that's not new. If I'm a car manufacturer and I want to know what other car manufacturers are doing and the pricing and maybe like even if I can get some read on the revenue numbers and which models are being successful, which ones are not. So all that kind of stuff. Market research, again, that's not a new idea. Like people have been doing it for a very long time.
Yeah.
Maybe now we can do it faster, better, with more accuracy. But generally speaking, that's actually not that new. And I would also mention that perfect example of that was COVID. I think even many tech giants were sharing location data with governments and even with the public. And they were doing it either like in real time or on a weekly basis. And again, this is just kind of for everyone's benefit because we generally wanted to know what's happening, like with the lockdowns and like people moving around or not. Yeah. And again, like we would call it alternative data, but it's just like data. So I think there are many use cases to mention because like how many use cases do you have for data in general? I'm sure there are loads.
That actually reminds me, maybe it was during the COVID period where some companies were leveraging the term I think they were using is fast data in the sense of credit card transaction, for example. As you were saying, those card provider provide data anonymized and available very widely. So it was important for some companies to be able to get some insight into like consumption and which industries are being hit more compared to the other one. And they knew that governments were only releasing this kind of information on a quarterly basis. Maybe some of them were giving some guidance on a monthly basis, but there was a proof of all this kind of data could be useful in terms of investments here.
That is very true. Yeah, I would say the industry definitely went through this period of boom during the COVID years, just because there was essentially no other reliable data source that people could use, right? And there was a lot of volatility, like behavior was changing from 1 month to another. Generally, people didn't want to wait till the end of next quarter to hear what, let's say, retailers would say about, the numbers. So yeah, it would definitely help the industry and kind of ignited interest in this space.
Velocity of the data, I mean, how critical that is for you, in your case, for your use cases? I guess it depends, but do you see that as a challenge as well?
Yes, it's, I guess, one aspect. So people talk about the lag. Am I going to get like a real-time reading or is it going to be like a bit of a delay? And of course, if you ask clients, they would always say, I want minimum lag. In reality, I would say it kind of varies. Usually you would have like a few days delay, which is something that most people find acceptable. But then there are other aspects here as well, like things like history is quite important because one thing is for you to tell me that, I have this amazing data, but I only have, let's say, 6 months worth of history. Well, then it's not really that useful because the biggest issue here is there is actually no way I can validate if your data is really good, right? So typically you need quite a few years of history if you want to kind of commercialize your product and make it of interest to data buyers in this space. We're talking, I would say, like 3 or 4 years typically would be the requirement. And then, of course, there are things like granularity, right? Some data products are aggregated. Sometimes you can actually get like a more raw level data. I heard this analogy being used a few times where they compare it to ordering steaks in a restaurant, right? So you have, you can be raw, can be medium, you can be well done. So they kind of use the same analogy with data. You can get some raw data, you can get some well done data. Well done data basically means somebody is telling me the actual insight about the company, right? I don't need to do any analysis.
Yeah.
And then I think in practice, most people want something that's like in between. Nobody wants to do manual tagging, manual cleaning. So I kind of like it. So it makes sense. Also makes me more hungry.
For our audience, what would be your recommendation for those developers or consultants that would like to get started with the old data? Oh, I'm saying that like a pro, old data, right?
Nice. So the interesting aspect of this industry is it's actually quite secretive, right? So if you compare it to, let's say, any other industry like tech, generally everyone is really open about how they use products and things like that. So in the alternative data industry, it's a little bit different. Generally, if people find a good use for a data set, they wouldn't be too open about it, I guess, like for kind of obvious reason, because it gives them competitive advantage in the market. But saying that, there is still some good resources. So like if we talk about developers, first of all, I would say like there are no people still use the same stack, the same tools as they would use elsewhere. Like for instance, where I work, we do a lot of visual data exploration, and guess what? Like we all use like visual analysis tools every day, and like being good with those tools definitely helps. Of course, like generic skills like Python and SQL are always useful. I would also say that like I've been involved in many interviews recently, like we're growing and we're hiring people, right? And I don't know about you guys, like if you've done many interviews recently, but it's just interesting to see what skill sets people kind of bring to the table.
Consider how tech is going, we might be doing. No.
Oh, you don't mean like interviewing other people, doing interviews yourself. I see. That's interesting. But yeah, so I will also interview many like junior people leaving university. And I would say many of them, like the way we interview people is we give them a relatively simple task. And we're just trying to understand how they think about the task. And I see this very common pattern that people spend disproportionate amount of time working on models, building models, tweaking their models, and don't spend enough time thinking about the kind of wider business context. And so like when we look for skills and we look for people, we like people who are kind of naturally curious. So for instance, with our task, there are some parts of the task which we leave that's like a little bit vague, and that's done on purpose because we just want to see what people do about those parts of the task, and like are they curious enough to then go and like research this company. That's basically what our task is about. So did they kind of, I don't want to reveal too much because some of these people I will be interviewing might be listening to this podcast, right? But generally there is definitely a common kind of skill that people like to see, in developers who are interested in this space, is just being naturally curious. It's because almost always you can solve a problem by just like finding a new data set rather than spending too much time tweaking the model, working with the data that you already have. And so that's a very common thing. But just in general for developers, I would say kind of resources. One you already mentioned, Christian, is like that podcast. I don't know if this is the same one. Alternative Data podcast run by a gentleman called Mark Fleming Williams.
Mark Fleming, yes.
Yeah, so I would recommend it. It's not technical actually, but you learn a lot because he has a very wide variety of guests. Again, kind of buy side, sell side, all different types of people join podcasts. It's actually very interesting because you almost sometimes have polar opposite opinions on the same subjects. You hear from different people. If you're lucky enough to live in New York City or London, you might be able to attend some meetups that people do, more in New York than in London. We actually used to run a meetup in London with a good friend of mine. Then we kind of stopped during the lockdown, but some of this might come back. Kind of when you meet people in person, they would typically share a bit more than they would share online, obviously. So I mentioned how secretive this industry is, but like when everyone goes to the most interesting part of it is that when everyone goes to a bar after the event, and then that's when people start actually sharing things. And then there are conferences, right? So conferences in general are very good, especially if you're just kind of new. If you go to too many of them, they might be a bit repetitive, but like if you're just getting started, and if you get a chance to attend one of these conferences, I would probably recommend doing that. They can be pricey, kind of, ideally you will need like somebody to sponsor you, I guess. But that's just another good source of kind of knowledge.
Yeah, I think that's really valuable, especially, I mean, as you mentioned, these data can be leveraged on multiple use cases, right? So if there is someone, listening to the podcast that might think that it can bring value to their existing use cases or something, then, there is another source there, right? So
it works both ways, by the way. In many cases, the way these alternative data sets emerge, and they just happen to have this data that could be extremely valuable to someone else, but they don't even realize it. So you kind of have these situations where a company might be doing something I don't know, like obviously there could be some NDA restrictions, but I could be issuing car insurance reports, and that would instantly give me visibility into all the car sales in the country, right? That could actually be a very valuable signal to car manufacturers or somebody else. So yeah, so sometimes you have to think outside of the box a little bit.
True.
About how these data sets could be monetized, and if you even want it to be monetized. But yeah, generally speaking, it kind of works both ways. Actually, the other thing I just wanted to say on the subject is in so many cases, I find that people start talking about external data before they fully leverage their own data assets that they already have. Especially in large companies, sometimes, let's say, a marketing department doesn't even know that there is some data set that a product department might have that already exists and the company already owns, but they just don't use it to its full potential. So that's just another thing I wanted to mention, that kind of you might already have some data assets internally available to you before you start looking outside elsewhere.
Great, fantastic. So we like to ask this question to all our guests. What will be the single most important professional piece of advice you ever received?
Oh man, I should have remembered that you always ask this question. I forgot. I listened to all your podcasts, but I forgot about this question. It's quite old now. It was Steve Jobs presenting in front of students at Stanford University, and he was talking about his experience and his career. And I think it's amazing speech. Like people just listen to it. But one thing in particular that he kind of talked about this idea how things make sense when you look backwards, when they don't necessarily make sense when you look forward. So in his experience, I think he studied like fonts typography at university. So how to write letters and what's the right way and different typefaces and styles. And then when they were like designing the very first Mac, they came up with this user interface that was unique at the time, only because Steve Jobs, according to him at least, because he studied that thing at the university. So looking backwards, it all made sense. Looking forward, maybe it looked a bit random. And I see it like in terms of kind of career advice, I would say that kind of makes sense. I kind of like it when people try different things and then they eventually find something that is their true passion, but then they manage to leverage some of these other things they did before. And this is maybe also goes a little bit into your conversation like you had on the previous podcast, Mark. You're talking about T-shaped individuals, right? So kind of how do you like learn many things about many different things, but then also specialize in something as well. So I don't know if this is not very concise, but that would be my kind of improvised answer to your question. Yeah, kind of try different things, and then it will all make sense in the end when you look backwards.
It's good. I love it. Yeah, I would like to thank you. Personally, I told you all the time when we used to work together, I learn always a lot from you, and today was no exception. Just very quick, where we can find you? Where can people actually follow you or the work you do?
Yeah, LinkedIn is good. I still use Twitter, despite the fact that Elon Musk has just acquired it. And yeah, like good old-fashioned email is also okay.
Twitter or Mastodon?
Oh man, no, I haven't looked at that yet. I heard of Mastodon. Are you guys on it already?
No.
There's already enough platforms out there.
It's interesting. Like remember Clubhouse? Like
fantastic,
everyone joined, but then left a week later.
But it was buggy.
Yeah, exactly. So find me on Clubhouse. How about that?
Thanks for your time, Alex, and we hope to see you again soon on the podcast, or maybe in London to have a beer.
Sure. Thank you, guys. Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to this episode. This podcast represents our views and not the ones of our employers.
Our mission at the Data Coffee Break podcast is to inform you and help you grow in this always changing data field.
Follow us and get into the conversation with the community on our LinkedIn page and Instagram.
See you next Tuesday, and until then, keep your data caffeinated.